depreciate late, then it will lose $40 of value over 4 years. And therefore, jumping down to question 2 for a moment, if you're going to lose 40 over 4 years, then under the straight line method, you assume that the loss of value, which is depreciation expense, will be $10 a year for 4 years. So that's the second question. As for the first question, it's worth $80 at the beginning of year one, 70 at the end of year one, 60 at the end of year two, 50 at the end of year three, so 50 is the correct answer, and then 40 at the end of year four when she sells it for 40. So 50 is the right answer for end of year three. Okay, now Louis comes along and Louis says, I'm buying the same plate, I'm using it for the same amount of time, but I think the more it's used, the more it loses its value. The less it's used, the less it loses its value. Who's right? Well, it's a judgment call. So it's tough to say who's right or who's wrong. For certain types of assets, you can tell. You know, if I have a building, then you can't really say the more that people walk in and out of a building, the more the building loses its value. But if there's an elevator in the building, maybe you could say the more times the elevator is used to take a trip, the more it wears down, the more it loses value. So it's really just a judgment call. Louis says, okay, I am going to use the bowl how many times? Well, if you look back at the first question, he's using the bowl 400 times. And the bowl is going to drop in value from 80 to 40 over 4 years. And so this is the way that I think through it. Year one, I'm going to use the bowl 200 times. That's 200 out of 400. So the bowl is going to lose half or 200/400ths of its value in year one. At the end of year one, the bowl will drop from 80 to 60 in value. Then comes year two. Year two, I'm going to use the bowl 100 times. And so, and it's a little hard to say, but I'm hoping that you can visualize it. Well, in year two, therefore, the bowl will lose 100/400ths of its value because I'm going to use it 400 times in total, 100 times in year two. And as a result, if it's losing 100/400ths of its value in year two, the end of year two, the bowl will be worth 50. Well, in years 3 and 4, using the same logic, it'll be worth, or it'll drop in value from 50 to 45 at the end of year 3, from 45 to 40 at the end of year 4. To summarize, over the 4 years, for Louis, the $80 bowl will drop to 60, to 50, to 45, and then to 40. So at the end of year 3, it'll be worth 45. And actually, in both years 3 and year 4, years 3 and 4, depreciation expense, the loss of value will be 5. Final question. No matter what method you use, no matter what assumption you make, that bowl is going to drop in value over the 4 years from 80 to 40. Sasha is making one assumption, Louis is making a different assumption, but they're both locked into the same essential element. And this goes all the way back to our first class session together, where I said fundamentally, accounting is all about value. That bowl is losing $40 of value over a 4-year period for both cougars. And therefore, the final question has the final answer as the correct answer. Okay, that concludes at least my explanation of the quiz. Any questions? And going once. And going twice. And okay. So we are done with depreciation, if you will. Just one final comment about it. Some students, and actually some business professionals, think of this as a choice. I can choose this method, I can choose that method. Well, in a way, it is a choice, but the choice is supposed to be based on the reality of the pattern in which assets lose value over time. Just to reiterate, if I'm talking about a building that will probably lose the same amount of value each year, no matter how many or how few people are in it in any given year, straight line makes perfect sense. On the other hand, if you're talking about some piece of equipment, including Sasha's and Louis' bowl, and if that piece of equipment wears out more and therefore loses more value the more that you use it, then straight line does not make as much sense as varying the depreciation year to year or period to period based on the amount of volume that it's being used for. Okay, hope that makes sense to you. I actually have one administrative comment, although I hope you're going to find this to be a very helpful one because it involves our first foray into video education. Hooray. And then I'll continue with the chapter. So if you go into files and you go back to content notes, it's the same place where you find my handouts, which are usually lists of illustrations and perhaps some supplemental notes from me. You're going to see all the way down at the end, at the bottom, it's the last file in the content notes subfolder, a word processing document called Chapter 18 Equity. And if you open that document, what you will find is a list of the illustrations that we'll cover. You'll note that there are no supplemental examples or explanations from me because I consider the material to be pretty straightforward. And then for the first time ever, you will see below the list of illustrations, links to videos. The link to the video for part A is here. Okay, then I have a link. It seems to be taking you to something called instructuremedia.com. That actually is Canvas, but it's my personal library of Canvas. It's not actually not directly the classroom Canvas section. If you click on the link, what I've done is I've recorded and uploaded to that section of Canvas. It's sort of my private section. I was shooting for a 15-minute video that basically helped you understand part A. I was off by a minute. It turns out to be about 16 minutes. But it is a video that takes you through illustrations 18.1 and 18.2. 18.1 and 18.2 actually give you most of the chapter. It's one of those situations where part A has a couple of illustrations that are more helpful than, or maybe as helpful as all the other illustrations in B and C combined. B and C just give you sort of different applications or different examples of A, the nature of equity. And so this is what I'd like to ask you to do. Number one, today, we'll simply continue talking about the current chapter, right? Long-term assets, chapter 11. Thursday, the quiz will cover what we discuss in class today. After the quiz on Thursday, I will do two things. Number one, I will complete chapter 11, and I will cover part A of chapter 18. However, I will cover part A of chapter 18, assuming that you will dedicate 16 minutes to watching the video, either before Thursday or after Thursday, but certainly before next week. Then, when we come back on Tuesday next week, we'll take a 5-question quiz on the end of chapter 11. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll take a 5-question quiz on part A of chapter 18. Okay, so let me say that again. We'll wrap up chapter 11, maybe halfway through Thursday's session. And then I'll cover part A of chapter 18, which will also be covered through this 16-minute video that I created. A week from today, we will take 2 quizzes with a 5-minute break in between. First quiz on the end of chapter 11, second quiz on part A of chapter 18. What am I doing? I want to see if this works. I want to see if the technology of the video here works. And I also want to see if splitting your attention between watching a video that will cover certain elements that I think can be taught by video, and yet having me still review it live with you on Thursday, I want to see if that will work. My 2 concerns, concern number 1, InstructureMedia.com is flawed in certain important ways. From a legal perspective, here's a way that it's flawed. One of the most important elements of Canvas for copyright legal purposes is that if I legally upload content that is copyrighted anywhere within Canvas, it is not available online on sort of a publicly available web page. And that's important under copyright law. However, if you take this link that I'm giving you on this sheet, Chapter 18 Equity, if you take this link and use it to watch my video in Canvas without logging into Canvas, it seems to work to me. It works just fine. And so that's obviously a technical problem. Now, don't worry, I don't think the copyright police are going to go crazy because a teacher who has the right to use a textbook is showing some textbook illustrations on the screen in a video for his students, but still, it's a flaw. It shouldn't, and it's a pretty fundamental one at that. And so I just want to see that if we have a fairly large number of students, in this class, use that link to watch a video that I've uploaded to a section within Canvas that doesn't seem to have a severe bandwidth constraint. I just want to see if it works. Number 2, I want to see how the learning experience changes when I move from basically talking through everything to some reliance on videos. Hopefully it will work, taking it a step at a time. Only way to figure it out, to see for myself, is to create my first 16-minute video, to cover it verbally in a class session as well, and to give you a quiz. Okay, I'll document all of this in my next weekly message this weekend, but I did want to show you where the link is. Did want to assure you that we are all aware within the school that you are able to access the video through the link, even if you're not logged into Canvas. If that helps you, that's great. By all means, feel free to access it. And I also wanted to say it's unusual, but instead of having one 5-question quiz on Tuesday, we'll have 2 with a 5-minute break in between. One to keep on track with chapter 11, and one to see how this innovative approach, if you want to call it innovative, works for part A of chapter 18. Okay, Alex, go right ahead.
So does this mean that we will have a quiz on Thursday, or are we devoting everything to Tuesday?
Right, so this Thursday, 2 days from now, we'll have a quiz on whatever we cover today regarding chapter 11.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And then after we take that quiz 2 days from now, we'll complete chapter 11, which will have a quiz on Tuesday next week related to it. And then we'll also cover chapter 18, part A, but I'll teach it a little bit differently because I'm teaching it presuming that at some point within the upcoming week, you're also watching the 16-minute quiz. Other questions? Dawn, go right ahead.
Okay, so will this replace one of our other quiz grades or serve as like an extra credit?
Right, good question. So I'm basically each 5-question quiz is counting up to 24. And so we'll take 2 different 5-question quizzes. Now, once we get to 24, 4 of them I will not count. And so instead of saying, well, this is the extra quiz that will not count, I'm simply saying each quiz counts towards the 24 quizzes that I am giving this semester. And whichever 4 should not count for each individual student based on what they do worse in or what they actually don't have a chance to take at all. Those will actually be the 4 quizzes that I don't count. And I also do intend to give some extra credit at the end of the semester, but this is not it. This is something different.
Thank you.
Sure, sure. Okay, Alex, your hand is up, but I don't know if that's the old question or a new question that you might have. Okay, Alex, you are muted and your hand is still up. So I will lower your hand for you, but please feel free to ask any questions that you wish, of course. Okay, so with all that in place, let me screen share, and then we'll pick up where we left off in chapter 11. Okay, Shafai, go right ahead.
Can you send us an email about all of these announcements?
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll put it into my weekly message, that I upload every week into the files section. And so you'll have everything that you need to know right there in the weekly messages. So I'll put it into the weekly messages. I usually only send supplemental emails if there's sort of a relatively last second, we're not meeting today, or something major is changing in the very short term. But I'll have everything documented in this weekend's upcoming weekly message. Okay, so this is where we are up to now. Let me unyellow or whiten the topics we just covered. We're picking up with illustration 11-10, depletion. Okay, what is depletion? Depletion is just like depreciation, but it involves natural resources like oil, gasoline, not gasoline, but natural gas, anything that you drill out of the ground, diamonds, gold, copper, coal, etc. Even fish. You know, you might spend a lot of money for the right to fish in a particular area of the river or the sea, the ocean. That actually is purchasing something that is an asset that will lose value over time as you pull the item out of the ground and sell it. And so 1110 says this: you're spending $2.76836 million for a copper mine. Now, technically, that purchase price is split amongst these 4 different subtotals, but the total purchase price is $2,768,360. And we think we're going to extract a total of 1 million tons of copper out of the ground. And we are using the units of production method, meaning the more copper you extract out of the ground, the more the asset loses value. And I'm tempted to say depreciates. It's just like depreciation. It's just that when we're using natural resources, if that's the asset, then we just use the word depletion instead of depreciation. Well, if the asset has a value of $2,768,360, and if we think we're going to pull 1 million tons out of the ground, then every time we pull or mine 1 ton out of the ground, the asset loses $2.76.836 in value. Right? If the total value is 2.7 million, and if every time we pull out a ton, it's going to lose some value. And if we have 1 million tons to mine, then every time we mine 1 ton, the depreciation each item is $2.76. What if we have a year where we mine 300,000 tons? Well, then the total depreciation, although we call it depletion, is $2.76 for each of the 300,000 tons. We reduce the value of the asset, copper mine, by $830,000. If we reduce the value of the asset, we reduce the value of the company. And once again, the textbook author, my pet peeve, simply uses the word depletion. This is an expense. This is depletion expense, $830,000. Any questions about item 10 or illustration 10? Okay, now we get to 11. I'm sorry, skipping 11, which is just a little bit of theory. Let's go to 12. Okay, 12 is the next on my list. Illustration 1012. Okay, so what asset is losing value? It is an intangible asset it is actually a pair of intangible assets, a franchise agreement. So that is a contract that gives me the right to operate a McDonald's. And a patent. Maybe I invented a new and exciting way to flip hamburgers at my McDonald's. And maybe I patented that new and exciting approach. If that patent is worth $50,000, and if I think the patent is going to reduce in value over time, because everyone is constantly finding new ways and better ways to flip hamburgers, then the patent and the franchise are both going to lose value over time. Well, any kind of contractual, a contract-based right is an asset. It's something that I own that has value, but it's not physical. So we don't refer to the word depreciation. And it's not something that we're pulling out of the ground. So we don't use the word depletion. We use the word amortization. Amortization means depreciation, but for an intangible, a not tangible asset. Okay, so what if we spend $200,000 for a contract, an intangible asset, and the contract's going to last 10 years? And let's say we're using straight line depreciation. Oops, I should call it straight line amortization. Then every year for 10 years, the asset called franchise right to operate a McDonald's, is reduced by $20,000. If the asset loses value, then, well, here the textbook author uses the word expense. The value of the company goes down by $20,000. Okay, what about the patent? Well, the patent is worth $50,000. Technically, I have the right to flip burgers in this special way for 13 years. But let's say I'm pretty sure that after 8 years, someone's going to come up with a better way to flip burgers. And therefore, even though I can keep flipping burgers this way for another 5 years, I'm pretty sure that after 8 years, when someone invents a better process, that the patent will be worthless. Well, okay. Then, if I'm using a straight line amortization approach, the $50,000 patent will be worthless after 8 years. And as a result, I'm going to reduce its value by 1/8, or $6,250 a year, for each year over 8 years. We reduce the value of the asset, which is a patent, which reduces the value of the company, which is an expense. What if after a few years, we sell the patent? Well, if we're selling the patent on the last day of the year, and if the patent has been losing value all year long, then we can't forget to depreciate it, or we will use the word amortize it, before we actually sell it. So, okay, first, let's depreciate the asset, or again, using the word amortize the asset, right before we sell it. And then let's go ahead and sell it. Well, what happens when we sell an asset? Well, we remove the asset from our books by reducing the value of the asset to 0. And at that moment, the asset on our books had a value of $18,750. We get cash when we sell it. And in this problem, we sell it for $21,000. Well, okay. If we have a transaction where one asset goes down by 18,750 and another asset goes up by 21,000, assets overall increase by 2250. Liabilities are not affected. So equity value increases by 2250. That is a gain or revenue on the sale of this asset. I guess the only slightly tricky thing in this part of the problem is if you haven't amortized or depleted or depreciated an asset lately, but if it has lost value since the last time that you amortized it, then you have to remember to reduce its value to what it is right now before you sell it right now. Okay, that concludes illustration 1112. Questions about it? Okay, and then on to 1113. And these are all sort of variations on the same basic idea. You know, is it losing the same amount of money each year, which we call straight line in terms of its value? Or is its value going down based on how much or how little the asset is being employed? In which case, it's units of production. Well, here, the first thing that the textbook author does is try to trick you. We're developing computer software graphics programs, but we don't even know that what we're developing is technologically feasible until June 30th. So prior to June 30th, we're just sort of playing around with the technology. You might need to play around with it to learn it, but is the cost of playing around with technology the same as the cost of developing or buying the asset? No. If you're playing around with something just to learn how to use it, if you're spending some money to do that, but you're not even trying to develop an asset, then that is in no way part of the cost of the asset you might eventually develop. And so beginning the day after June 30th, when you realize, hey, I've been playing around, I might be able to build an asset here. From that point forward, you spend $800,000 seriously building a product. And so that becomes the value of the asset that you build. However, like much software technology, the asset that you build is going to become obsolete. It's going to lose value over time. And therefore, you will need to depreciate, or again, since this is a intangible asset, you'd probably use the word amortize it. So we think it's going to take a total of 4 years for someone to produce a better program, and thus our $800,000 program, which is worth $800,000, will reduce in value to 0 over 4 years. Okay, on a straight line basis, we can just reduce it in value by 200 a year over 4 years. But hold on. What if we expect to sell $10 million worth of this asset over 4 years? And what if 3 million of the 10 million of sales will happen in the very first year? That's 30%. Well, if 30% of our sales of the asset will happen in year 1, should we depreciate or amortize 30% of the cost in year one, which is like units of production, except we're using revenue as a type of production? Or should we say, no, straight line is just 25% each year for 4 years? Well, once again, it's a judgment call. But whichever one you use, you reduce the value of the asset, which reduces the value of the company, which creates an expense. Okay, any questions about amortization of software development costs? Imran, go right ahead.
So because it wasn't feasible on June, it didn't become feasible on June 30th. We don't incur the cost of 1.2 million.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, I would put it a little differently. They spent the money. They spent the 1.2 million. So in a way, they incurred it. But if you're playing around with technology and you have no idea whether or not what you're trying to build is technologically feasible, you're really just playing around, and so it's the FASB says, preliminary just playing around costs aren't really part of the costs of having a formal business-like process to build the asset. And so what the textbook author does, and it's not wrong, he presents this information as if it's sort of a formal statement of a regulation. Costs incurred prior to the point of technological feasibility are excluded from the cost of the product. Well, that's true. But what's really happening is, in any kind of developmental process like this, you usually do spend some money just playing around before you get to the point where you start to truly try to develop something like an asset. And so that's what's happening here.
Thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. My pleasure. Okay, that concludes part A. Now, part B is actually called additional issues. And whenever you see any textbook author use a part of the chapter heading called additional issues, it's really just odds and ends. So yeah, it's important, but there's probably not going to be anything completely new and very deeply meaningful in something that is actually just odds and ends. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go over to, okay, hold it. 11:15, looks like that's still, okay, that's B. No, I just flipped over it, sorry. So this is in part B. This is 11:15. And actually, this looks, when I first looked at illustration 11:15, I thought to myself, yikes, there's a lot of information here. And it looks like a mess. And I thought, but it's not that complicated, this topic. It's not complicated at all. What is going on here? And so it's really just a matter of the textbook author presenting information up here in just a messy way. Okay, so let me try to explain this by actually going down to the chart, which is down here. And then I'll back up a little bit and talk about the way that the textbook author is presenting the information. So you're buying an asset. It's worth $250,000. Okay. Decrease cash $250, increase value of asset by $250. Okay. How many years am I going to use the asset? And at the end of that period, am I going to sell it for anything? Well, again, just to very selectively dip in, the assumption is that I'm going to hold on to this asset for 5 years, and I'm going to sell it for $40,000 at the end of 5 years. Well, okay. So if I'm using straight line, then each year for 5 years, the asset's going to lose a certain amount of value. And since over the 5 years, the value is going to drop from 250 to 40, over each year for 5 years, it will lose 210 of value. Okay, so if it's worth 250, and if every year it's going to lose 210 of value, 210 divided by 5 is 24,000. Each year for 5 years, the value of this property, which begins at 250, will go down by 24. So by the end of the first year, it'll be worth 226. By the end of the second year, it'll be worth 202, etc. And then by the end of the 5th year, it will be worth 40, and that's when we'll sell it to 40. Okay, 2 years go by. It's losing value according to that straight line method. Okay, what is its value at the end of the second year? Well, it's down to 166 net book value. Okay. At the end of the second year, 2 things change. Number one, you suddenly say, I don't think I'm going to hold on to this for 5 years in total. I think 2 years have gone by, and at this point, I'm going to hold on to this asset for another 6 years. Whoa. So the value of the asset on your books has gone down to 166. And you're now going to hold on to it for 6 years? That wasn't the original number of years estimate. And you say, yes, that's true, but that's what I believe to be true right now. The world changes. I think I'm going to make do with this asset for another 6 years. And furthermore, 6 years from now, when I'm finally ready to stop using it and to sell it, I don't think I'm going to be able to sell it for 40. I think I'm only going to be able to sell it for 22. And so this is what you think. You say, okay, when I first bought this asset for 250, I said, I think I'm going to hold it for 5 years and then sell it for 40. And so that locked me into a certain depreciation pattern that at a certain date, January 1st, 2024, brought the value down to 166. So far, so good. Suddenly, as of this date, you're telling me this is going to last 6 more years, new estimate, and when I sell it, I'm only going to get 22 for it, new estimate? Yes. Well then, beginning with this date, when the estimates are changing, I'm going to reduce its value by 144 over the remaining 6 years, or 24 years. Okay, and just realize, so when I referred to 24 up here, what I was referring to when I referred to the 24 that you see up here was not the original depreciation numbers pre-estimate change. It's what depreciation will be a year per year after the estimates change. So let me summarize briefly, and then let me go back and pick through just a little bit the given numbers. What's happening here? I buy a $250,000 asset. I initially think I'm going to hold it for 5 years and then sell it for 40. That means that initially I'm going to depreciate it by $210 a year for 5 years. Initially, the annual depreciation expense is 42. 2 years go by. The value of the asset has been depreciated for 2 years. It's down to 166. Suddenly, assumptions change. Now you believe that this asset, which at that moment is worth 166, is going to last you from that moment forward another 6 years. And suddenly you believe that its residual value, that's what you will sell it for at the end of 6 years, is only going to be 22. From that point forward and for the next 6 years, you revise the amount by which it loses value each year. You have a new annual depreciation number. And assuming that there are no other changes to your assumptions, at the end of that new 6-year period, the asset value will be down to 22, which hopefully you will get when you sell it. Just a quick comment or two about why it's really hard to see what the problem is all about just based on the textbook author's way of presenting it. So it's true that initially the life of the asset was assumed to be 5 years. Then when you're 2 years in, you're told it has 6 years to go. So suddenly the estimate changes from 5 years to 8 years in total, because when you're 2 years in, it has 6 years to go. But you never actually, at any given moment in time, depreciate the asset over an 8-year period. First, you're thinking 5-year period. And then after 2 years, you're thinking 6-year period. But it's not like at any given point in time at the very beginning, you're thinking this thing might last me for 8 years. Likewise, there's a reason why the residual value under these circumstances tends to drop. If you're going to use an asset for a longer period of time than you initially thought you would, then by the time you eventually stop using it, it's really going to be run down. More run down than you thought it would be. And so whenever you're extending a useful life of any asset, including your laptop computer, including your cell phone, you might say, let me hold on to my laptop or let me hold on to my cell phone for a longer period of time, delay the time at which I'll have to replace it. But what will happen is when you eventually have to replace your laptop or your cell phone, it will be even older by the time you bring it in to trade it in. And of course, the residual value, the trade-in value, will be even less. Hold on to it anyway. That's what an accountant would say, because it always helps to delay, the time during which you're going to have to spend money. You can put the money to other purposes like investing it. Okay, bottom line though, as you can see, there's nothing new or different about illustration 1115 than any other illustration. The only idea or concept that differs is that Sometimes when you're in the middle of owning an equipment or an asset of any kind, the assumptions change. And so all you do is say, well, what is the value of my asset right now? And then based on the new assumptions, how much should I be depreciating it or depleting it or amortizing it by from now until I eventually sell it or get rid of it? Okay, questions, any questions? Okay, tell you what, there's a natural breaking point after 1117. And so I'm going to cover 1117 with you, and then we'll call it a day. However, if you say, gee, might I have a few extra minutes? Well, you can use the few extra minutes however you wish, but one nice way of using these few extra minutes that I might give you today is by watching that 16-minute video. So you might be thinking, can't get away with that. Can't I just have the few extra minutes? Well, you can if you want, but don't forget about that 16-minute video there. Okay, but in any event, last illustration for today. Same idea, except here, what you're talking about is not a change in an assumption where the assumption is how much will I sell this thing for, or how many years will I use it before I sell it. Here, the assumption is there's a change in the method itself. And so basically you have an asset and you're depreciating it using an accelerated depreciation method. So think about a luxury automobile, a Lamborghini. Well, actually, Lamborghinis usually go for a lot more than $100,000. But expensive automobile, like any brand new automobile, the moment that you drive it off the new dealer lot, it loses an awful lot of value, especially if it's a luxury car. And apparently this car is going to last for many years, but it loses 40% of its value the moment that you buy it new and take it off the lot. Why? No one wants to buy a used Lamborghini. If you can afford a car like that, you're going to want to buy it new. And so as you can see, in the first couple of years that you own this car, straight line depreciation just makes no sense. And then 2 years in, the value of the car is $250. And suddenly something happens. Now, the textbook author doesn't say what happens, but something happens and you decide that straight line depreciation is appropriate. Does things like this, or do things like this happen in the automobile industry? Actually, yes, it does. I remember when Saab, so European car brand, spelled S-A-A-B, it was never considered quite a luxury car, but it was considered an expensive imported European brand. Saab was bought by a Chinese, that's mainland China, automobile company. And people just thought about Saabs differently once it was bought by a Chinese producer of very inexpensive cars. Now, is that right? Is that wrong? Everyone has their own opinion, and I'm not telling you what to think. But all I'm saying is that in the market, there are times when certain automobile brands are bought by other types of automobile brands that have a very different perception. And suddenly, if they're no longer seen as a luxury car, then they may not lose nearly as much value when you buy them new as you drive it off the lot. And so that's sort of what the textbook author is thinking. When the textbook author says, after a couple of years, the perception of this asset changes, and suddenly straight line seems quite reasonable as a depreciation method. Well, okay, 2 years have gone by. What's the value of this car on the books after 2 years? Well, it actually lost $160,000 worth of value. It's only worth $90,000 now, but you still have a car that's worth $90,000. How many more years do you expect to own it? 3. And after 3 years, do you still expect to sell it? Yes, and I expect to get $30,000 for it. So if at this moment in time, January 1st, 2024, the asset on your books is worth $90,000. If it'll be worth 30 in 3 years when you sell it, then it will lose $60,000 of value over 3 years. From this point forward, you will depreciate it straight line, $20,000 a year for 3 years. Okay? It's really the same idea. It's just that the assumption that you're changing is not an estimate. It's the method that you intend to use. And it's not like you're just changing from one method to another at random, which is sort of implied by the way that the textbook author says, well, the company just switched. No. I mean, companies do switch, but it's usually because something has happened to the asset, whether it's the physical asset that changed or it's the way that customers perceive the asset in this particular situation that changes. Okay, any questions about 1117? And as I start to go through my going once, going twice, going 3 times, let me color this in. I will upload this version, as always, to Canvas. But those will be the items that will be tested on the next quiz on Thursday. Any questions going once? Any questions going twice? Okay, well, class is over. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you did enjoy spring break. I will upload this document to Canvas after we take our quiz on Thursday. We will complete chapter 11 and do part A of chapter 18. And again, in these extra 15 minutes of time that you have, you can go out and enjoy yourself if you wish. Or if you choose to do so, you can watch that Part A, Chapter 18 video. Give it a shot. Although, don't need to do that until Tuesday next week. And with that, I'll still stick around for my usual post-class session Q&A and discussion. But as for the class session, class is dismissed. See you guys on Thursday. And okay, guys, if you have any other questions, we're now in the post-class phase of today's session. Any other questions? Going once? Maybe there's just such a desire to watch the video of chapter 18 that people don't want to ask questions. Or maybe it's also true that compared to other chapters, this is sort of both straightforward and somewhat intuitive. At least I hope you're feeling that way. Going once for questions. Going twice. 3 times. Okay, guys, I hope you have a great day and a great tomorrow. I'll log off now, and I will see you all on Thursday. Take care.